Welcome to Essential Dynamics. I'm your host, Eric Hudson. Essential Dynamics is a framework we've been developing to help us think through tricky situations. And Essential Dynamics podcast is a way to explore those ideas using deep conversations with interesting people. I'm joined today with my colleague, both at Unconstrained and on the podcast, Dave Kane. Dave, welcome back.
Hello there.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's been a good week, and I'm kind of looking forward to continuing the conversation that we started. I think we opened a few doors there, and there's a few pieces I'd like to explore a little bit more before we get too far along here. So
do you have that encapsulated in a kickoff question or something?
Yeah, because last time we sort of introduced this. You coined the systems dysfunction. We started talking about why systems were sort of everywhere within organizations as well as nature and machines and stuff, but they're not always running as well as they could. And so you sort of got into the systems dysfunction piece. I think the other piece we sort of hopped across was this is common. Like it's not always our fault that we have this, because systems, they just sort of organically exist within organizations if they're not intentionally addressed. But it's just the way we're taught and the way we're brought up in the workforce and the way we're in our silos in education and those types of things. And it's hard. It's like everything is sort of structured to discourage the conversations around systems. So I like the idea of sort of exploring a little bit more. And I'd really like to get into what are the consequences of not looking at it as a system and always being in a silo? So I know you've had a lot of experience sort of on the planning and the leadership side. So, and I think you've been in organizations that have had systems dysfunction, and I think you've also found the flow. So I kind of want to just sort of quiz you on a little bit of what happened because you didn't have it, and then how did that get fixed? Is that fair? You okay with that?
Yeah, the consequences of systems dysfunction. Well, one comes to mind, which isn't our organization or anything other than an experience that, because it was important and intense, you just remember and notice it a little bit more. About 13 years ago, my wife and I were in Hawaii. And we'd been there one day, and we were exploring a really cool little cove and following an established path that wasn't a good path. And she slipped and fell and bounced about 15 feet down to the rocky beach and broke her ankle and a couple of vertebrae and bonked her head and had a bit of a concussion and lacerations and bruises. And yeah, it was pretty awful. And so she ended up being in the Hawaii healthcare system for 10 days before making it back to Alberta. And, we have a public system and they have a private system. And we watched the private system operate. And then we watched the interface with the public system, and then we watched the public system operate when she came back. And it was just an example of, as users of the system, we were having an experience, when particularly my wife was having an experience that wasn't flowing all that well. And it was nobody's fault. And in this case, it was, two jurisdictions colliding. But here's the one situation I want to talk about. In the US, even though it's a private system, you can't refuse somebody care, and you can't discharge someone who still needs care unless they're going to someplace that has care. So my wife's in the hospital. She's got a back brace. She's got a soft cast on her ankle. She needs surgery because her foot's not connected to her leg anymore. And she needs surgery, and they decided it would be better to do that in Alberta so she could get the post-op care and stuff like that. But the problem is they can't move you to a hospital unless that hospital has a bed for you. And in the US, they would book ahead and they would do a transfer and they'd figure it out and the insurance would follow and everything would be fine. But changing jurisdictions, you don't book a bed in an Alberta hospital most of the time. And especially if it's, sort of a trauma situation. And so we were able to, was talking to some friends of ours in the system, find an orthopedic surgeon who basically said, I will tell the Maui hospital that we have a bed for you.
Yeah.
Come to emergency and tell us your name and you will be triaged and eventually you will be admitted and there will be a bed for you, but there's no bed for you until you show up. And so that's how the system worked. And our insurance actually covered an attendant. So a paramedic flew from Toronto to Maui and sat with my wife and accompanied her on the trip in first class, not me, but the two of them on the way back and right up to the hospital until she was admitted and then went on her way. And so she had great care and the surgery was awesome and she's made a great recovery. But the system was not functional in the sense that there was a handoff that, was pretty obvious how it could happen. And it took us 3 days or something to figure out how to explain that to both sides so that it would actually work.
Right. So the system, worked well, except for, yes, this information gap or information flow blockage that sort of held the whole process up for it.
Yeah. And we typically talk about a single organization, but how many times have we seen as a customer or as an employee in an organization see those things break down where, the information or the approval or the materials aren't where they need to be and the process stops. And also a lot of times the accountability stops.
Yep.
And so
I think that's a good point. Like when we're talking systems, it's not always contained within the organization itself, because, when you're looking at, your oversimplification last time of, input, process, output, not always single organizations are doing that. You have to be working with others in order to get the output you need.
Yeah.
So systems go beyond the boundaries of your organization.
A really good example of that was when an oil tanker went aground in the Suez Canal, or in the Gulf, wherever it was, and all of the flow of cargo ships in the Middle East stopped, and that affected all kinds of organizations who could think of themselves as a system. But they have inputs coming from all over the place. So there's a great interdependency. But for our purposes, we also see that within the boundaries of an organization.
Right.
And there's maybe less of an excuse for allowing that to happen. You talked in your sort of opening question about silos get in the way. And the silos affect things like visibility and attention or accountability. So if you're the sales part of the organization, your job is to make promises and write them down. If you make vague promises or over ambitious promises and then feed that into the system, someone down the line is not going to perform. And the question is, does the salesperson see that? Do they know? Do they care? But that's a very, very, very common problem that you would have that would be an indication of systems dysfunction is you make promises that you can't meet and then push that off to the next level in the organization to deal with.
So circling back to the question of, the consequences of system dysfunction, whether it's in that sales one or, in the hospital side of things, in that example, the consequences of that were both financial to the system, as well as sort of the customer experience, if we want to go marketing and or hospital side of these types of things. So they're probably not seen as these large blockages, when somebody was looking at the whole thing, they just sort of figured, oh, we just have to make sure there's a bed to go to for a whole lot of safety reasons, that kind of thing. But when the system is sort of put into motion and you realize there's that blockage there, that one little thing is going to result in financial consequences, customer relations consequences. Like it has its impacts on your performance as well as your future.
Yeah. And so there's like pain and suffering or unrealized expectations that customers have. There also tends to be a lot of work that seems necessary, but that wouldn't be necessary if there was flow in the system.
What do you mean by that?
So things like sort of an expediting function or customer complaints department, things like that, where there's a subsystem that's been developed just because the system isn't flowing.
Right.
And so you could invest the effort into getting the system to flow. And instead you are trying to patch up and remediate because it didn't flow. You and I were in a conversation yesterday with a client where they talked about the difference between having the customer open a box and find a defect, having an inspection team at the end of the line find a defect, and designing a system that would never allow a defect to get that
even
far.
reach those guys. Yeah, exactly.
There's also a cost in time. And, in the health system, where that's kind of how we measure it, because we don't pay in the public system. You don't pay per transaction. Obviously, our taxes fund it. And so the measurement is a wait list.
Yeah. And how, the time probably makes things more difficult or more expensive to fix. The other example is so much of the work that you do, at least that I did in sort of the corporate services areas, if I just had, the information flow better, I would have got to the result a lot faster rather than, going through all these processes and learning key pieces later on, or not being integrated with those providing the service, those generating the value. I didn't have the information, and we're operating separately trying to achieve the same cause because there was no flow. And so my time, ends up getting done on things that either aren't needed or could have been done in half the time. So there's a cost to that as well.
So let's talk about that in terms of consequences of systems dysfunction as an employee. It's demoralizing to be given a task, and maybe even in the context of it's explained to you why it's really important. And then within the organization, not be able to get to the information that you need to complete the task, and then not be able to report it to your customer because they're too busy, or to be able to, sort of hand your work in and then see nothing change in the system. That's at some point you approach your new tasks with less enthusiasm.
You impact your energy flow.
That's right.
You have this drain on it. Yeah.
And so to kind of be, just work from your own sense of, your own moral compass and your sense of being responsible and putting in the effort for the salary you get. That can only compensate so much for contributing to, the natural addition of value that you could place on the system as things move down the line. Like the feeling a part of it is, I don't know, when the times when that's happened, that's so motivating. And when you feel like there's futility, it's very, very demoralizing and demotivating. And so the cost of a bad system isn't just felt by the customers, it's felt by the participants as well.
Yeah. And your ability to get the most out of the people working for you. the resources you have, if you want to look at it in a terrible way like that.
Well, yeah. So on the one hand, there's a more efficient use of resources. And on the other hand, if you think of people as people and not as resources, they have a way better experience when they know that they're contributing, and they see that value move through the organization. Mm-hmm. The other thing that gets lost with systems dysfunction, I think, is any kind of visibility to where the real problems are.
Because I know we've said before that, the value of a high functioning system is that it sort of identifies the areas that need attention, and it's sort of this self reinforcing loop. You're sort of saying the reverse of that, right?
Yeah. If there's so much noise in the system and so much chaos, then when something really, really bad goes wrong, you can't find it. You don't know what happened.
Yeah.
But when you have flow and there's a disruption, you know it, and you can pinpoint,
and you can react to it quickly.
You can react quickly
sort of, and mitigate the challenges. Yeah.
So then another thing that systems dysfunction, this is I don't know if it's a cause or an effect, but we always talk about purpose as the starting point. If you're not clear on your purpose, then it's easy to allow system dysfunction to accumulate, which is going to further obscure your purpose. And you and I have worked in the public sector. We've worked with not-for-profits as clients. They are a little bit more susceptible to dilution of purpose because they don't ever have a profit motive, which is at least some kind of centralizing force. And so the more dysfunction there is in the system, the harder it is to figure out what you're even trying to do. And so from time to time, you have to have this purge of, purpose, programs, value streams, trying to figure out why are we here and what are we doing. Mm-hmm. And that's
the consequences of that I've seen is then you just get into a position of doing stuff for the purpose of being seen as doing stuff.
Yeah.
You're not exactly sure whether it's, improving the system, but it's, well, I'm active, I'm doing this piece and I can demonstrate an outcome from it.
I was in, this is back in the business process re-engineering days in the 90s, but I was in a meeting that I'm sure I was, facilitating and organizing, and we were mapping out the strategic planning process of this organization. And I was very naive. I was learning a lot, but I didn't know a lot. And so we had this flow chart and about 10 or 12 people, and we said, let's figure out which of these steps here add value without very much context from a system point of view, right. But let's figure out what ones add value. And I'm going to be kind of facetious and exaggerate, but one person's job was to print the reports and put them in the blue binders. And the next person's job was to take the blue binders apart and put them in file folders and pass them on. I'm being very ridiculous. But the blue binder person, we said, well, what about that step? And the answer was, well, I'm adding value because the next step requires blue binders. And I'm like, oh, that's what I finally learned. Like, of course, everyone does something because they have a downstream customer that's, looking for it.
Demanding it. Yep.
But whoa, like we got to go way back and say, what are we trying to accomplish here? And how do we turn our input into output? Like, how do we actually, change data to information, to a decision, to an action? How do we, put sub assemblies on it in a finished component or finished product? We lose that perspective. And so if you have systems dysfunction and you're in the middle of it, you have no way of actually functionally being able to improve the system. You don't know if you should just walk away from your desk and it would be better.
Yeah, and you're right. And when there's this, it's almost like a chaos when the system isn't strong or there's dysfunction. As you're talking about it, my mind keeps going back to the silos, which seem to be the nemesis of a system. And it's those types of environments that sort of reinforce the silo thinking. And I've seen, attempts to try and get past that where when you come to say your business planning for the year or your strategic planning, and the organization comes up with the 4 or 5 common themes or initiatives everyone wants to go for. We're going to work on these 4 things as a company. And then they take it down into the silos and everybody builds their own initiative that's going to use those words and come back to it. But they're never interlinked. And it reinforces that piece to the point at which everybody working on it feels, oh, I have a cause and a reason for doing it. They don't get the chance to step back and see that big picture, and or they don't have the tools to say, well, how is this touching the value stream, or how is this implementing the system? And it drove me crazy. Of the language was there and everybody thought we were sort of working on it as a system, but as soon as things go back towards the silos, as soon as you're sort of working on a piece in isolation, you're increasing the chances of this dysfunction.
So we're going to pick this up and talk about the opposite. We're going to talk about system flow. I'm just for a minute here. I'm going to try and bridge the two a little bit, and that is to our listeners. If you're in a leadership position in an organization, ask yourself the question: to what degree are we experiencing system dysfunction, and why do we put up with it? And if you're in any other position, like sort of below that, and or a consumer of a system's output or whatever, and you're not happy, ask the same question. Well, am I part of systems dysfunction, and why do I put up with it? And the answers, and if you're not going to put up with it, the answers are different if you're a leader than they are if you're, a cog in the wheel. But the cost of systems dysfunction is so high, both in productivity, which we've talked about before, and in feeling good about yourself as a person, that I don't think we should.
And as a customer, yeah,
as a customer, I don't think we should accept it. And so, I guess my T-shirt then, my vote for the T-shirt from last time is it's the stupid system, and we don't have to put up with it.
Yeah. And asking those questions to the different viewpoints of the leadership or those within the system, perception is not always reality, and people don't always identify and notice the system's dysfunction unless you're either stepping back or feeling the frustration.
That's right. You might feel there's something amiss and you can't put your finger on it. Stepping back is a good one. Getting in touch with the customer, understanding what the customer is experiencing is another good one, or even just your downstream customer if you can't manage to see to the end of the process. But there's no end of dysfunctional systems out there. But most of them haven't been tagged like that, and most of them don't have an advocate that's trying to move to flow.
Okay, well, I know you have your views on flow and how that helps these things, but let's leave it here, put this out there, and then talk to a few more people, get a few more stories that we aren't a part of and I haven't heard of, and see if we can come back with a bit more of a solution on, okay, how do I identify that dysfunction, and how do I achieve the flow to get past it?
Well, thanks very much, Dave. And so to our listeners, again, if you have stories of systems dysfunction that you want to share, even on a confidential or no name basis, please do, because we are students of systems dysfunction and systems flow.
And we have our hypothesis, but it's good to test them. The more times you test them and refine them, I think, then we come back and share them, and then everybody can sort of take a little piece away from it. So
yeah, it's all about the learning journey. That's for sure for us. Well, thanks very much, Dave. Bryn Griffiths, thanks very much for pushing the record button and making us sound good. And everyone, thanks for, as always, for listening and sharing your ideas. I'm Derek Hudson, and until next time, consider your quest.